Single dad waiter says, "Your translator lies." CEO escapes a multi-million-dollar scam attempt. Okay, so I don't even know where to start with this one. I've been lurking on this forum for about 2 years now, reading everyone's stories, and I always told myself I'd never post because my life just didn't feel interesting enough to share. But after what happened last Tuesday, I genuinely needed to put this somewhere outside of my own head before it swallows me whole. So here we are. Bear with me because this is long, and I promise every single word of it is real. My name's Lucas. I'm 34. I have a son named Noah, who's 8 years old and thinks ketchup is a food group. And for the past 14 months, I've been working as a waiter at a restaurant called Aldridge, which is one of those places where the tablecloths cost more than my rent, and the menu doesn't have prices because, if you have to ask, you probably shouldn't be there. I got the job through a friend of a friend who felt sorry for me. And honestly, I wasn't too proud to take it. When you're starting over from zero with a kid depending on you, pride is the first thing you learn to leave at the door. But before I get into what happened that night, I need to give you the background. Because without the background, none of it makes sense. 3 years ago, I was a completely different person. I wore suits that were actually tailored. I had a company with 12 employees and a client list that took me 4 years to build. I had a partner, a guy named Alan Priest, who I'd known since we were both broke and ambitious and splitting the cost of a shared office space downtown. We built everything together, or at least that's what I thought. Turns out I was building and he was positioning. There's a difference, and I learned it the hard way. Alan is the kind of man who looks trustworthy because he's mastered the art of looking trustworthy. He's got one of those faces that reads as honest, slightly tired around the eyes, a voice that never quite raises itself, the kind of guy who always seems to be listening even when he's plotting. He wore the same style of watch for 10 years, a cheap one, because he said he believed in humility. I respected that. I was an idiot. What he did to me, and I'll keep this short because I've told this story enough times that it doesn't cut the same anymore, was orchestrate a fraudulent accusation that painted me as the one misappropriating funds from our shared accounts. He manufactured documents. He coached a former employee. He filed the complaint himself and acted devastated when he did it, tears and everything, told mutual friends he had no choice. By the time I understood what was happening, the damage was already done. Clients left. Accounts were frozen. My lawyer fees alone emptied what little I had saved. The case was eventually dropped. Eventually. But by then the word had already spread through the industry like smoke through a building, quiet and everywhere at once. My marriage didn't survive it. I don't blame her, honestly. She held on longer than most people would have. But there's only so long you can watch the person you married slowly disappear under the weight of something they didn't cause. And she had her own life to live. We split when Noah was 5. The custody arrangement we landed on was mostly fair. But mostly fair still means I spend certain mornings making his lunch, and certain mornings staring at an empty chair at the kitchen table. And both of those things live in the same chest. I moved cities, changed everything. Got the job at Aldridge, got a small apartment with a bathroom that smells faintly of the previous tenant's cologne, no matter how many times I clean it. Got Noah settled into a school where he actually seems happy, and started putting one foot in front of the other in the way that single dads learn to do. Not because anyone teaches you, but because the alternative is staying on the floor and you can't do that when there's a kid who needs breakfast. I had not seen Alan Priest in 2.5 years, and then he walked into my restaurant. I almost dropped the tray I was carrying, and I mean that literally. I felt my fingers go loose around the edge of it like my body reacted before my brain caught up. I had to take one very deliberate breath and remind myself where I was and what I was wearing and what my name was on the reservation sheet. Lucas Merritt, Table 4, water and bread service. Don't you dare make a scene. He didn't see me at first. He came in with 2 men I didn't recognize. European-looking. Formal. The kind of businessmen who travel in packs and speak in numbers. And he was already talking, already performing, already being Alan Priest, which is to say he was already taking up more space than he'd been given. He had a new watch. An expensive one. Of course he did. He sat at table 7, which was in my section. Of course it was. I stood behind the service partition for a full 1.5 minutes just breathing. My manager, Derek, walked past and gave me a look like, "You good?" And I nodded because what was I supposed to say? Actually, no. The man who destroyed my life just sat down at table 7 and now my hands won't stop shaking. I just nodded and picked up the tray and walked out. Here's the thing about working a job like this for over a year. Your body learns to run on autopilot in a way that your mind doesn't. My feet carried me to the table. My hands set down the breadbasket. My mouth said, "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you off with something to drink in exactly the tone they teach you?" Calm and invisible. And Alan Priest looked up at me, and for 1/2 second something moved behind his eyes. Something that wasn't quite recognition, but was close to it. And then it smoothed over and he looked back at his guests and said, "Water for the table, please." He didn't recognize me, or he pretended not to. I'm still not entirely sure which one it was, and I'm not sure it matters. What I know is that I walked back to the service station and stood there with my jaw clenched so tight I could feel it in my temples. And I thought about Noah. I thought about the morning after the accusations broke, when he was 5 years old and he crawled into bed next to me at 6 a.m. because he'd had a bad dream, and I held him and stared at the ceiling and thought, I have to figure this out. I thought about every shift I'd worked since then, every tip I'd pocketed, every night I'd come home smelling like other people's food and sat on the edge of Noah's bed, watching him sleep for a few minutes before I let myself go to pieces in the kitchen. And I thought about the envelope. The envelope is something I need to explain, because it's the part of this story that most people find either crazy or poetic, depending on who they are. After I moved cities, after everything settled into its new and quieter shape, I started doing something that probably wasn't healthy but felt necessary. I researched Alan, not obsessively, not every day, but steadily. The way you might monitor a weather system you know is going to hit eventually. I found patterns, I found names, I found 3 other people who had gone through variations of the same thing I had, different industries, different details. Same blueprint. One of them was a woman named Renata who ran a small accounting firm in Milford. One was a guy named Tim who'd had a translation consultancy. And one was a former client of Alan's who'd agreed to talk to me on the condition I never use his name publicly. I built a file, printed documents, screenshots, dates, signed statements, put it all in a manila envelope that I kept in the front pocket of my backpack because I didn't trust my apartment to be safe enough, and I didn't have anyone to give it to for safekeeping. I'd carried that envelope for 6 months. I used to think that was sad. That night, it felt like the most sane thing I'd ever done. So there I was. Alan Priest was at table 7. He was clearly working as some kind of translator or intermediary for these 2 European men. I could hear them slipping between English and German and Alan smoothly switching registers, all polished professionalism. And across the restaurant, at table 3 near the window, was a woman named Diana Voss. I knew who Diana Voss was because everyone in the industry knew who Diana Voss was. She ran one of the most respected legal consultancies in the region, the kind of firm that took on cases other firms considered unfixable. She had silver-streaked hair she wore pulled back without apology, reading glasses she took on and off with a kind of unconscious authority, and she'd arrived alone, which told me she was the kind of person who didn't need an entourage to feel significant. I'd served her twice before. She always ordered the same thing, tipped well, said thank you like she meant it. She was waiting for someone. I could tell by the way she kept glancing at the door, and then the someone arrived. The 2 European men from table 7 stood up, crossed the room and sat down with her. Alan followed, shaking her hand with that smile of his. The one that looks like warmth but is actually just really good timing. The meeting had begun, and I had a decision to make. I stood at the service station and watched them for a while, refilling things that didn't need to be refilled, hovering at the edges of the room the way you learn to when you need to be present without being noticed. I caught fragments of conversation. Alan's voice carried in that particular way confident men's voices do in quiet rooms, not loud, just inevitably audible. And then I heard something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. It wasn't a full sentence. It was 4 words in German, directed at one of the European men, said in a tone that was lower than the rest of the conversation. My German is non-existent, but I'd had Tim, the guy from the translation consultancy, the other person Alan had burned, teach me a handful of phrases over our phone calls, enough to recognize the shape of what was being said, even if I couldn't parse every word, enough to know it wasn't right. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came over me in that moment without it sounding dramatic. But here's my best shot. It felt like being handed a key that I'd been looking for so long I'd almost forgotten what the lock looked like. It felt like something that had been frozen in my chest for 3 years suddenly cracking open, not warmly, not with relief, with something closer to dread actually, because I knew that if I was right about what I'd just heard, and if I let it pass, I would have to carry that too, along with everything else. I went to the back. I texted Tim. Quick question is the phrase, what I heard, what I think it means. He replied in under 2 minutes. Yeah, roughly. She doesn't know what she's agreeing to. Why? I stared at that message for a long time. Then I looked at my backpack on the hook by the lockers, at the outline of the envelope through the fabric. I thought about Noah asleep at his grandma's place that night, with his dinosaur pajamas and his one stuffed animal that he's had since he was 3, and still sleeps with even though he'd rather die than admit it to his friends. I thought about Alan Priest shaking my hand the day we signed our partnership agreement, telling me he'd never had a partner he trusted more. I walked back out onto the floor, picked up a water pitcher that didn't need to be picked up, and started moving toward table 3. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further with this. Walking toward that table was the longest 30 feet of my life. I know that sounds like an exaggeration. I know people say things like that all the time and it rarely means anything. But I need you to understand what was happening inside my body during those maybe 12 seconds it took me to cross that restaurant. My heart was doing something I can only describe as a rhythmic panic, not racing exactly. More like stuttering, like a car engine turning over in the cold. My left hand was gripping that water pitcher so tight I could feel the tendons in my forearm pulling. The soles of my shoes, which are black and rubber-soled and completely silent on that marble floor, felt like they were made of concrete. Every step felt like a conscious decision, like my brain had to sign off on each one individually. The restaurant was full, not chaotic full but comfortably, quietly full, in the way that upscale places get on a Tuesday. Low murmur of conversation, the occasional soft clink of silverware, someone laughing at something near the bar. Nobody was watching me. I was a waiter with a water pitcher. I was furniture, and that invisibility, which I'd resented for 14 months, was the only thing I had going for me in that moment. Alan was talking. Of course he was. He was explaining something to the 2 European men in that measured, confident voice of his, occasionally pivoting to translate for Diana, and she was listening with the focused stillness of someone who makes her living reading between lines. She had a legal pad in front of her. Actual paper, not a tablet, which I'd noticed about her before and found quietly impressive, and she was taking notes in a handwriting that looked sharp and deliberate even from a few feet away. The contract was on the table, a thick document, off-white paper bound at the corner with a binder clip. I could see it from where I was standing. I could see Alan's hand resting next to it like it was already his. I reached the table and did what I always did. Quiet approach from the right, slight lean. Refill the glass closest to the edge first. Professional. Invisible. Can I get anything else? I set it to the table in general, the way you're trained to, eyes neutral, posture easy. One of the European men shook his head without looking at me. The other was mid-sentence. Alan glanced up and for the second time that evening something moved behind his eyes, and this time it stayed there a fraction of a second longer before disappearing. Still not full recognition, or still a very good performance of not recognizing me. Either way, he waved a hand in the polite dismissal that people who are used to service give when they want you gone. Diana looked up at me, though. That was the difference between her and everyone else at that table. She actually looked at me. Not in any particular way, not with suspicion or warmth, just she looked. The way some people do, like eye contact, is a basic courtesy they extend to everyone regardless of what they're wearing or what they're carrying. She had dark eyes behind those reading glasses, steady and unhurried, and she said, "I'm fine, thank you." Like she was saying it to a person and not to an obstacle. I nodded and started to step back. And then Alan said something in German to the man on his left. Quiet, casual, the kind of thing you say when you're confident nobody at the table understands you. I understood enough. It wasn't complex, it wasn't coded, it was just easy, Comfortable. The comfort of a man who has done this before and never once gotten caught. He was telling them, in the most relaxed possible tone, that the clause they were concerned about had been softened in his translation. That she wouldn't push back on the language because she didn't know the original said something different. That they should let her finish reading and then move straight to the signature page. I stood completely still for probably 2 full seconds. Then I set the water pitcher down on the edge of the table, gently, precisely like I meant to, leaned forward the smallest amount and said very quietly, directly to Diana Voss, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I think your translator is giving you a different version of what's being said." The table went silent. Not gradually. Instantly. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind that lands on a room like a hand pressing flat on a drum. Diana's pen stopped moving. The European man who'd been mid-sentence stopped being mid-sentence. And Alan turned his head toward me with the slow, controlled movement of someone who is deeply, genuinely alarmed but has trained himself not to show it. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was still level, still measured, but I knew that voice. I had sat across from it at a conference table for 4 years. I knew every single register of it, and what I was hearing right now was the version that sounded calm, because the alternative was losing control. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Diana. "There's a clause in that document," I said, still quiet, still steady, "that he described to you as a standard liability limitation. In the original German, it transfers a significant portion of your decision-making authority on international dealings to the co-signatories. It's not the same thing." Diana did not react the way most people would have. She didn't gasp. She didn't look at Alan. She looked at me, directly, searchingly, the way someone looks when they're running a rapid internal calculation about whether to trust what they're hearing. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then she closed the legal pad. "Gentlemen," she said, and her voice had the quality of a door closing. "I'm going to need a few minutes." One of the European men started to speak. She held up one finger. Not rude, just final. He stopped. Alan pushed back slightly from the table. "Diana, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. This gentleman is a waiter, he doesn't—" "I heard him," she said, still not looking at Alan, still looking at me. "What's your name?" "Lucas," I said. "Lucas." She said it like she was filing it somewhere. "Do you speak German?" "Not fluently." "Enough." She nodded slowly, then looked down at the contract on the table. Then she looked back up at me. "Is there anything else you think I should know before I continue this conversation?" And there it was. The question I'd been carrying an answer to for 6 months in the front pocket of a backpack. I reached into the pocket of my apron, which is where I'd put the envelope 40 minutes earlier. When I'd gone to the back after Tim's text, when I'd made the decision I didn't fully know I was making until my hands made it for me. And I placed it on the table in front of her. "Yes," I said. "There is." I'll never forget the sound Alan made. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even really a sound. It was more like the absence of breath. A quick hollow intake that he immediately tried to cover with a cough. But I heard it. And I think Diana heard it too, because something in her posture shifted, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, in his direction. I straightened up, picked up the water pitcher and said, "I'll give you some privacy." I walked back to the service station on legs that felt completely disconnected from my body, set the pitcher down and stood there with both hands flat on the counter, staring at the wall in front of me. My manager, Derek, appeared at my elbow about 30 seconds later. "What did you just do?" he said. Not angry, not yet, just watchful. "I'm not entirely sure," I said honestly. He looked over at table 3. Diana had opened the envelope. Alan was sitting very still in the way that people sit when they're deciding whether to run or stay. The 2 European men were exchanging glances that had a lot of private conversation happening inside them. "Should I be calling someone?" Derek asked. "Probably," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Derek is a practical man, mid-40s, the kind of person who's seen enough of life that very little surprises him anymore. But he had an expression on his face right then that I can only describe as careful respect. Like he was recalibrating something. Okay, he said. And he walked away without asking anything else. I stood there and watched. Diana read. She read slowly, with the glasses on, one page at a time, and I could tell from the way her shoulders were set that she wasn't performing calm. She was actually calm, in the way that experienced people are calm when they find out something bad. Because they've been through enough bad things to know that falling apart is a luxury you defer until the work is done. She went through the whole envelope, every page. Alan said something to her twice. Both times she raised that single finger without looking up, and both times he stopped. The European men spoke to each other in German. Low and rapid, and whatever they were saying did not have the energy of people who were planning to stay. At some point, I don't know exactly when, I'd stopped tracking time. Diana put the last page down, took off her reading glasses, and looked directly at Alan Priest for the first time since I'd walked away. I couldn't hear what she said from where I was standing, but I could see his face. And I want to be really precise about this because I've replayed it probably 100 times in my head. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the look of a man who has built his whole life on the assumption that he is smarter than everyone around him, and who has just for the first time encountered evidence that he might not be. It looked like the ground moving. I busied myself with other tables because I needed to do something with my hands, or I was going to start shaking visibly. I refilled waters. I took a dessert order from a couple near the window who were very much in love and completely unaware that 20 feet away, something irreversible was unfolding. I smiled at the right moments and said the right things, and the whole time my internal monologue was just a single repeating phrase that I can't fully transcribe here, except to say it rhymed with holy shirt. Then one of the European men stood up. He said something brief and final sounding to Alan, shook Diana's hand with a formality that felt almost apologetic, and walked toward the exit. The other man followed. No goodbye to Alan, no backward glance. Just gone. And then it was just Diana and Alan at table 3, and the envelope, and everything inside it. I don't know what they said to each other in the next several minutes because I made myself stay away from the table. I know it wasn't short. I know it wasn't quiet, though they kept their voices down the way people do in public when the conversation is the kind you'd normally have in a room with a closed door. At one point I saw Alan gesture in my direction, and Diana shook her head with a sharpness that closed that subject immediately. He left first. He stood up, straightened his jacket with both hands, that specific gesture men do when they're trying to reassemble themselves, and walked out of the restaurant without looking at me. Or maybe he looked. Maybe there was a half second when his eyes found me across the room. Honestly, I can't be sure because by that point I was so deep inside my own head that the physical world had a slightly muffled quality to it. Like everything was happening behind glass. The door closed behind him. I let out a breath I think I'd been holding for about 45 minutes. Derek appeared again. "The woman at table 3 is asking for you," he said. I straightened my jacket, smoothed my apron, walked over. Diana Voss was sitting alone at the table with the envelope in front of her and her legal pad open to a fresh page. She looked up when I arrived and studied me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between assessment and something else. Something quieter. "Sit down, Lucas," she said. "I'm technically on the clock," I said. "I know." She said it with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Sit down anyway." I sat. The restaurant kept moving around us. Plates came and went. Somebody laughed at the bar. The couple near the window ordered 2 desserts and split them. And I sat across from Diana Voss and told her everything. About Alan, about what he'd done, about the 3 years, about Noah, about the envelope and why I'd been carrying it and how I'd recognized Alan the moment he walked in, and how my hands had gone loose on the tray. I told it the way you tell things when you're too tired to perform them. Just straight. Just true. She listened the entire time without interrupting. When I finished, she looked down at the legal pad where she'd apparently been writing while I talked, even though I hadn't noticed her writing. Then she looked back up. "How long have you worked here?" she asked. 14 months. Before that? I ran a consulting firm. Before it was taken from me. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up the envelope, tapped it once on the table to straighten the pages inside, and said, "I'm going to need to make some calls tonight. Do I have your permission to use this?" That's why I kept it, I said. She held my gaze for a moment. You've been carrying this for 6 months. Yeah. In your backpack. Front pocket. Something moved across her face. Not pity. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't pity. It was closer to the look someone gives you when they understand something about you that you didn't expect anyone to understand. Okay, she said. She wrote something on the legal pad, tore the page off, and slid it across the table to me. A phone number. Call me tomorrow, not text, call. I looked at the number, then back at her. What happens now? I asked. She closed the legal pad, gathered her things, and stood up with the envelope tucked under her arm like it had always belonged there. Now, she said, I do my job. She left a tip that was larger than most people's dinner bills. Derek found me in the back afterward, staring at the lockers where my backpack was hanging lighter than it had been in half a year. You okay? He said. I thought about Noah's dinosaur pajamas, about the envelope that was no longer in my front pocket, about Alan's face when the ground moved. Yeah, I said. I think I actually am. I didn't sleep that night. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way where someone tosses and turns and stares at the ceiling with a single tear running down their face. It was messier than that. I got home around 11:30, changed out of my work clothes, made myself a cup of coffee I didn't need, and drank half of it standing at the kitchen counter, staring at nothing in particular. Then I sat on the couch. Then I lay down on the couch. Then I moved to the bed. Then I was back on the couch at 2 a.m. with my phone in my hand, reading Diana's number on that torn piece of legal pad paper like it was going to tell me something it hadn't told me the last 14 times I'd looked at it. My apartment was very quiet. That specific kind of quiet that only exists when your kid isn't home. Not peaceful quiet, more like the quiet of a room that's missing something it's supposed to have. Noah was at his grandma's, my mom, 3 blocks away, which is one of the small quiet miracles of my current life. She moved here 8 months after I did, said she wasn't going to let me raise that boy alone in a city where she didn't know the streets. I didn't argue. Some gifts you just take. I kept going over everything. Every moment of that evening, frame by frame, like footage I needed to review before I could file it anywhere. The way Alan's voice had carried across that quiet restaurant. The way my fingers had gone loose on the tray. The weight of the envelope leaving my apron pocket and landing on the table in front of Diana. The sound Alan made. That hollow, involuntary intake of breath, and when he saw it. That sound kept coming back to me. I'd replayed it so many times by 3 a.m. that I was starting to doubt whether I'd actually heard it or whether I'd constructed it afterward, because I needed it to be real. That's the thing about moments like that. Your brain is so overloaded in the middle of them that the recording isn't always clean. You get impressions more than memories. Flashes. The smell of the room. The weight of your own heartbeat. The specific quality of a silence that falls over a table when something irreversible has just been said. What I knew for certain was this. Alan had left that restaurant alone earlier than planned. Without the contract, without the clients, and without whatever he'd walked in expecting to walk out with. And Diana Voss had left with the envelope tucked under her arm like a weapon she already knew how to use. Everything else was noise I couldn't do anything about until morning. I finally fell asleep somewhere around 4. Fully clothed on top of the bed covers, phone still in my hand. My alarm went off at 7 because Noah needed to be picked up by 8:30 for school, and I'd promised my mom I'd take him so she could make a doctor's appointment. I got up, washed my face, stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment longer than usual. I looked tired in the specific way that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with having spent years carrying something heavy. But underneath that, and I noticed this. I want to be honest that I noticed this. There was something different in my face. Something that hadn't been there the morning before. Not relief exactly. More like the very first suggestion of relief. Like the sky at 5 a.m. before the light actually arrives. I picked up Noah at 8. He came out of my mom's apartment with his backpack on sideways and a piece of toast in his hand. Hair still damp from the shower, talking before he'd even cleared the doorway about something that had happened in a video game the night before. I stood there on the sidewalk watching him walk toward me, and I felt that thing I feel sometimes that I genuinely don't have the vocabulary for. That specific overwhelm of loving someone so much it almost reads as pain. He's the reason I moved. He's the reason I took the job. He's the reason the envelope existed at all. If I'm being honest, because the day I built that file was the day I understood that I couldn't keep waiting for justice to find me. I had to be in a position to meet it when it came. "Dad, you look weird," Noah said, stopping in front of me and squinting. Good weird or bad weird? He considered this with the gravity that 8-year-olds bring to important questions. "Just weird," he concluded and took another bite of toast. I walked him to school. He talked the entire way about the video game, about his friend Marcus, who'd apparently done something either impressive or catastrophic at recess the previous day, depending on which part of the story you were listening to, about whether ketchup technically counted as a vegetable. I listened to all of it. I listened in the way I try to listen when I catch myself being present, not waiting for him to finish so I can respond, but actually there, in the conversation, in the morning, on that specific sidewalk with the cracked corner piece that he always steps over and I always step on. At the school gate he turned and gave me the kind of hug that kids his age give when they're not quite old enough to be embarrassed about it yet. Full body, brief, complete. Then he ran off toward his friends without looking back, because that's how kids leave, like they're absolutely certain you'll still be there when they return. I stood at the gate for a moment after he disappeared inside. Then I called Diana Voss. She picked up on the second ring. No preamble, no, "How are you this morning?" Just, "Lucas, I've been up since 5. Are you somewhere you can talk?" I was standing on a sidewalk outside an elementary school, but I said yes. "Good," she said. "I need to tell you some things, and I need you to stay calm while I tell them." That's not a sentence that makes anyone calm, for the record. She told me she'd spent the previous evening making calls. Not a few calls. A lot of calls. She'd reached people she described simply as colleagues in a tone that told me these weren't just professional acquaintances. She'd gone through the entire envelope, every document, every statement, every date. She'd cross-referenced some of it with things she'd apparently already suspected about Alan from a previous case her firm had been peripherally connected to. She didn't elaborate on that yet, said she'd explain when we met in person. And she'd spoken late the previous evening to Tim. I stopped walking. "You spoke to Tim?" "His contact information was in the envelope," she said. "His signed statement was thorough. I needed to hear his voice when he confirmed it." A brief pause. "He sends his regards, by the way. He cried a little. I thought you should know." I didn't say anything for a moment. Tim was a quiet guy, mid-40s, rebuilt his life after Alan with a stubbornness that I'd always found more inspiring than he'd want to be told. The image of him crying on the phone to a stranger at 11 at night because something was finally moving. I had to stop and look at the sky for a second. "Okay," I said. "What happens next?" "What happens next," Diana said, "is that you come to my office this afternoon at 2 o'clock and we have a proper conversation. Not a restaurant, not over the phone. My office." "I work tonight," I said. "I know. 2 o'clock works before your shift." I almost asked how she knew what time my shift started. Then I realized that Diana Voss had probably gathered more information about me before 9 a.m. than most people gather about anyone in a week, and I decided to just go with it. "I'll be there," I said. "Bring nothing," she said. "I have everything I need." She hung up before I could respond, which I was starting to understand was just how she operated. I walked back to my apartment through streets that felt different than they had the day before, which I know sounds like the kind of thing people say for effect, but I mean it more literally than that. There's a particular texture to days when everything has shifted but the world hasn't been notified yet, where you're walking through the same city, same sidewalks, same corner store with a hand-painted sign in the window, but you're a different version of yourself inside all of it, and nobody around you knows. That morning had that texture all the way through. A man on a bicycle nearly clipped me at an intersection and I didn't even really react. Just stepped back and kept walking like nothing could touch me that day, which was either confidence or shock, and I still don't know which. I got home, showered properly, made actual food for once instead of whatever was fastest. Sat at my kitchen table and ate eggs and thought about what I was walking into at 2 o'clock. I want to be honest about the fear here because I think it's the part of stories like this that people leave out, and leaving it out makes the whole thing feel less real. I was scared. Not in a vague, abstract way. I was specifically scared that I had just pulled a thread that was attached to something larger than I could manage. I was scared that Alan would retaliate in some way I hadn't anticipated, because that was what Alan did. He anticipated, and he moved first, and he made sure the narrative was already set before you had a chance to offer yours. I'd lived inside that particular fear for 3 years. It didn't vanish overnight just because something had shifted. But here's the thing. Underneath the fear, and this is the part I keep coming back to, the part I want anyone reading this to hold on to, underneath the fear was something else that had never been there before in 3 years of carrying this. A sense that I was not, for the first time, doing this alone. That the envelope was in someone else's hands now. That those hands belonged to a woman who'd gone through it page by page at 10 o'clock at night, and then made phone calls until 5 in the morning. That mattered more than I knew how to say. At 1:15, I put on the cleanest non-work clothes I owned. Dark jeans. A plain gray shirt, the jacket I'd bought secondhand 6 months ago that fit well enough that people sometimes thought it was new. And I took the bus to Diana Voss's office, which was in a building downtown that had the kind of quiet authority that serious places have. Not flashy, just solid. The kind of building that looks like it has never once been uncertain about anything. The receptionist led me to a conference room on the 4th floor. Wide windows, natural light, a table that was almost aggressively clean. Diana was already there, standing by the window with a coffee in her hand, wearing a different version of the same composed authority she'd had the night before. On the table in front of her chair was my envelope, and next to it a file that was at least 3 times thicker. She turned when I came in and looked at me for a moment with that measuring quality she had, like she was taking a reading. "You look better than you did last night," she said. "I got 3 hours of sleep," I said. "So did I." She gestured to the chair across from hers. "Sit down." I sat. She sat. She opened the file. "Alan Priest," she said, "has done this to at least 6 people that I can currently document. You are number 4 in the timeline. There are 2 more after you." She paused and let that land. "He has a system. He identifies businesses or individuals who are entering negotiations where a language gap exists, inserts himself as the trusted intermediary, and then works both sides, collecting fees from the opposing party while deliberately mistranslating to benefit them. He has been doing this for at least 7 years. The room was very quiet. 7 years, I said. At minimum. She turned a page. The 2 European men from last night, I spoke to one of them this morning. Turns out they had their own suspicions about Alan's methods. They were testing him last night, actually. They'd planted specific language in the contract to see if he'd translate it accurately. She looked up at me. He didn't. I sat with that for a moment. So they were already on to him. They were gathering evidence. What you did last night accelerated their timeline considerably. She tilted her head slightly. You may have actually saved this deal rather than killed it. Diana is considering re-entering negotiations through a different channel. I had no idea what to do with any of this information, so I just nodded and let her keep going. She talked for 40 minutes. She laid out what she was intending to do with the file, the statements, the documented evidence. She used words like civil fraud, professional decertification, coordinated complaint. She told me that Tim and Renata had both agreed to attach their names formally. She told me that the former client, the one who'd insisted on anonymity when he'd talked to me, had apparently reconsidered overnight after Diana called him. At the end of it, she closed the file and looked at me. This is going to take some time, she said. These things don't happen overnight, but I want you to understand something clearly. She held my gaze in that steady, unhurried way of hers. What you built in that envelope and the timeline, the documentation, the signatures, that is the foundation of everything that comes next. Without it, this is just allegations. With it, it's a case. I looked at the envelope on the table. The plain manila envelope I'd bought at a drugstore, filled at a kitchen table, carried in a backpack for 6 months. I just didn't know what else to do with it, I said honestly. Diana was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I've thought about every day since. Sometimes, she said, not knowing what else to do is exactly the right instinct. I took the bus back to my apartment, changed into my work clothes and went to my shift at Aldridge. Derek nodded at me when I came in. I nodded back. I picked up my tray and went out onto the floor and started doing my job. The same job I'd done for 14 months. The same tables, the same marble floor, the same quiet choreography of invisibility. But the front pocket of my backpack was empty, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt exactly right. 3 weeks passed before anything visible happened. I want to be upfront about that because I think when people tell stories like this, they have a tendency to compress the timeline, to make it feel like one thing led immediately to the next in a clean, satisfying sequence. Real life doesn't move that way. Real justice, the kind that actually sticks, moves at the pace of paperwork and phone calls and people in offices reading documents carefully before they sign anything. It's not cinematic. It's slow and procedural, and there are days in the middle of it where you genuinely can't tell if anything is happening at all. Those 3 weeks had that quality all the way through. I went to work. I picked up Noah from school on my days. I made dinner. I helped with homework about fractions, which Noah approached with a personal grievance I found deeply relatable. I called Diana every few days, and she gave me updates in the measured, factual tone of someone who knows that information delivered without drama is easier to carry. Things were moving, she'd say. The documentation was being reviewed. The right people were being contacted. She used the phrase building the structure more than once, and I came to understand that this was how she thought about legal processes, not as attacks, but as architecture. You don't knock a wall down by running at it. You find the load-bearing points and you work from there. Alan, as far as I could tell, had no idea what was being built. That was the strangest part of those 3 weeks. The normalcy of everything on the surface. The city kept moving. The restaurant kept filling up every evening with people who had no idea that one of their fellow diners 3 weeks earlier had quietly detonated something that hadn't finished falling yet. I served tables and refilled water glasses and said, "Enjoy your meal," approximately 400 times. And somewhere across the city, Alan Priest was presumably going about his life with the confidence of a man who had always gotten away with things and had no particular reason to believe that was about to change. I thought about him more than I wanted to admit during those 3 weeks. Not obsessively, not in the consuming way I had in the first year after everything fell apart, but steadily, the way you think about weather you can hear coming. I wondered what he was doing, whether he'd found another negotiation, another language gap, another person who trusted him because he'd mastered the performance of being trustworthy, whether the night at Aldridge had rattled him at all, or whether he'd already filed it away as a close call and moved on. I wondered whether he remembered me, whether my face had eventually surfaced through whatever mechanism of suppression he used to keep the people he'd hurt from taking up too much space in his mind. And then, on a Wednesday morning in the 4th week, Diana called me at 7:45 a.m. while I was making Noah's lunch. "It's starting," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me first." I put down the bread knife. "What happened?" "The Professional Licensing Board received the formal complaint yesterday afternoon. Coordinated filing. All 5 names, all documentation, submitted simultaneously so there's no opportunity to address them separately." She paused. "His certification has been suspended pending investigation. As of this morning, he cannot legally operate as a certified translator or intermediary in any professional capacity." I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone with one hand and a butter knife with the other, and I didn't say anything for a moment. "Lucas?" she said. "Yeah," I said. "I'm here, I stopped. Tried again. "How long does a suspension like that last?" "Pending investigation, indefinitely. Given the volume and quality of documentation, I expect it becomes permanent." Her voice had that particular quality it got when she was being precise because precision was a form of kindness. But that's just the beginning. The civil proceedings are separate and will take longer. This is the first domino. The first domino. I thought about that phrase for a long time after I hung up. I finished making Noah's lunch, turkey sandwich, apple slices, the specific brand of crackers he would accept and no substitutes, put it in his bag, walked him to school, and then stood on the sidewalk outside the gate for a good 5 minutes after he'd gone in, just breathing the morning air and trying to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't the explosion of relief I'd imagined it would be. Back in the years when I used to fantasize about this moment the way people fantasize about things they're not sure will ever arrive. It was quieter than that. more internal, like something that had been braced against a wall inside my chest for 3 years, had very slowly, very carefully, begun to lower itself down. I called Tim on the walk home. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "You heard," I said. Diana called me 20 minutes ago." His voice had that particular thickness that grown men get when they're trying to manage something emotional in real time. I keep picking up my phone to call someone and then not knowing who to call. "I know," I said. "My ex-wife doesn't even know the whole story," he said. "My kids don't know. I've been carrying this thing Lucas, I've been carrying this for longer than you have." "I know," I said again. "Does it feel like you thought it would?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "Not exactly," I said. "It feels more like, when you've had a headache for so long you stop noticing it. And then it goes away and you realize how much background noise it was making the whole time." A silence. Then, "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like." We stayed on the phone for a while after that, not talking about much, just two guys walking around their respective cities on a Wednesday morning, processing something that didn't quite have the right shape for language yet. There's a specific kind of companionship in that, in being understood by someone who went through the same thing differently. Tim and I had built something over those months of phone calls and shared documentation that I don't quite know what to call. Not friendship exactly, though it was edging that direction. More like fellow survivors of a specific storm who'd found each other in the aftermath and decided the rebuilding was easier if you didn't do it entirely alone. What I didn't know yet, what neither of us knew yet, was that the licensing suspension was only the surface event. The thing that was actually going to dismantle Alan Priest's life was already in motion, had been in motion since Diana made her 5th phone call on the night of the restaurant, and it was about to become very, very public. Here's what Diana hadn't told me yet, either because she was still confirming it or because she was protecting me from the noise while the structure was still being assembled. One of the European men from that night at Aldridge, the one who'd been testing Alan, the one Diana had spoken to the morning after, was a senior partner at an international business consultancy with offices in 4 countries. His name was Heinrich Brauer, and he had been approached by 2 of Alan's other victims independently, months before the restaurant, through a professional network that Diana described simply as people who track these things. He had come to that dinner not as a potential client of Diana's, but as a witness. The entire evening had been, on his end, a controlled exercise in documentation. Alan had walked into a room that was already a trap. When Diana finally told me this, about 10 days after the suspension news, I was sitting in her office again with a coffee I'd barely touched. She laid it out with the same architectural calm she brought to everything, and I listened and felt the story rearranging itself in my head in real time, all the pieces I thought I understood shifting slightly to reveal a structure underneath that I hadn't seen. "So he was already being watched," I said. "For months," she confirmed. "What you did that night didn't start the process. It accelerated it by approximately 6 months and provided the domestic documentation piece that Heinrich's team didn't have." She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "You were the missing piece. Lucas. Not the whole puzzle." I sat with that for a moment. "Does Alan know how much of that night was planned?" "Not yet," she said. And something in the way she said it told me that the moment he found out was going to be significant. It happened on a Friday. I know it was a Friday because I was at work, mid-shift carrying a tray of appetizers to a table near the back, when my phone buzzed in my apron pocket with a message from Diana that said simply, "Check the news." I finished the table service, went to the back, pulled out my phone, and searched Alan Priest's name for the first time in months. The first result was a business news article published 40 minutes earlier. The headline used words like fraud, multi-jurisdictional, and professional misconduct. His name was in it. His photo was in it. The professional headshot from his website, the one where he looked calm and capable and precisely as trustworthy as he'd spent years engineering himself to appear. The article mentioned 5 complainants. It mentioned Heinrich Brauer's firm. It mentioned a coordinated filing across 2 licensing bodies. It did not mention me by name. Diana had made sure of that. She'd asked me early on whether I wanted to be identified publicly, and I'd said no, Not because I was afraid, but because I had a son who didn't need to Google his dad and find a news article about corporate fraud. She understood immediately and arranged everything accordingly. I read the article twice, standing in the back of the restaurant in my apron, with the sounds of the kitchen behind me and the dining room in front of me. And I felt something that I want to try to describe accurately because I think it matters. It wasn't triumph, I want to be clear about that. People expect it to feel like triumph, like a fist raised, like a score settled, like the climactic moment in a movie where the good guy stands over the wreckage and the music swells. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt more like setting something down. Like walking a very long distance carrying something that was never yours to carry, and finally reaching the place where you could put it on the ground and leave it there. There was grief in it too, which surprised me. Not for Alan. I want to be very clear, I felt nothing for Alan except a kind of cold completion. But grief for the version of myself that had existed before all of it. The guy who'd shaken Alan's hand at the partnership signing and meant every word of what he said about building something together. That guy had been real. That trust had been real. And no amount of justice changes the fact that it was real and then it was destroyed. You carry both things, I think. The relief and the grief. They don't cancel each other out. Derek found me in the back, still staring at my phone. He read my face with the particular fluency he'd developed for reading mine over 14 months. Something happened, he said. Something happened, I said. He nodded. Didn't ask what. Just clapped me once on the shoulder. Brief, solid, the kind of gesture that communicates everything it needs to without requiring a single word, and went back out onto the floor. I put my phone in my pocket and followed him. Because the restaurant was full and the tables needed attending and life. In its magnificent indifference to the internal seismic events of the people moving through it, was absolutely not going to pause for mine. But I want to tell you what happened to Alan in the weeks that followed, because I think you deserve to know. And because it happened gradually and completely in the way that real consequences do when they finally arrive. The article spread. Not virally, not in the way that celebrity scandals spread, but in the specific professional networks where his reputation had been currency for years. By the weekend, people who had referred clients to him were calling those clients. By the following week, 2 of those clients had attached themselves to the civil complaint. His website went quiet. No new posts, no new listings. The kind of digital stillness that in professional circles reads as clearly as a closed sign on a door. His LinkedIn connections dropped in a pattern so steady it must have been visible to him in real time, like watching a tide go out from a window. I know this because Tim watched it and sent me updates with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that I completely understood. He'd lost more than I had in some ways. More years, more money, a marriage that had already been under strain when Alan finished it off. His updates had the quality of a man who had been waiting a very long time to exhale. Renata called me herself, which I hadn't expected. She was warm and direct and told me she'd cried when the suspension was announced. Happy crying, she clarified. The kind where you're not entirely sure why you're crying, except that your body seems to know something your mind is still catching up to. I told her I understood completely. The 2 people after me in Alan's timeline, the ones I hadn't been able to reach during my research phase, both came forward within the month. Diana told me about each of them with a quietness that felt respectful of what it cost them to do it. One was a small business owner. One was a contractor who'd lost a significant international deal through Alan's interference. Both had spent years thinking it was just bad luck, just a deal that went sideways, just the unpredictable nature of business. Finding out it had been deliberate, that there was a person behind the loss, a decision, a system. Diana said that was always the hardest part for people. The randomness of bad luck is one thing. The intentionality of it is another. Alan's apartment lease was not renewed, according to a source of information I won't specify, but which came from someone in Diana's network who monitored these things. He moved. To where I didn't know and made a deliberate decision not to find out, because knowing where he was would mean I was still tracking him, and I was done tracking him. He could go wherever he went. The structure Diana had built would follow him in the way that professional records follow people, quietly, permanently, visible to anyone who thought to look. The last update Diana gave me about Alan directly was on a Tuesday afternoon, 3.5 weeks after the article. She called me between meetings, voice brisk and efficient as always, and said that the civil proceedings had been formally filed and served, that he'd been served in person at what turned out to be a temporary address, that he had 30 days to respond. How did he react? I asked. I'm not entirely sure why I asked. Maybe I just needed to know he was real in that moment, and not just a name in a document. Diana was quiet for exactly 1 second. His hands were shaking, she said. I didn't say anything. I thought you should know that, she said. And she moved on to the next item on her list, because that was Diana. The work was always the next thing. The emotions were noted and filed, and the work continued. I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd stood 14 months ago eating whatever was fastest. Too tired to cook a real meal, too ground down to care. And I thought about Alan Priest with shaking hands being served with civil proceedings at a temporary address. I thought about my dad's old saying, the one he used to use that I'd always found too simple to take seriously when I was young. The bill always comes. It does, I thought. It just doesn't always arrive on your schedule.